For all that we hear about how we live in an information society, where some of the most valuable products are intangible, the truth is that human beings need food, shelter, clothes, and other tangible goods to survive and prosper. We depend upon transportation systems involving rail, trucking, ocean and river shipping, and air carriage to get goods from one country to another. And while modern technology such as GPS units, vacuum packaging, and refrigeration equipment reduces some of the risks of loss or damage to cargo, there are still a lot of things that can go wrong when a company's products are shipped across national boundaries. Over the years, a number of legal doctrines have evolved through judicial decisions, statutes, and treaties which make it easier for parties to a transportation contract to allocate these risks and to predict how much, if any, loss or liability they will incur if something goes wrong. In this video, we'll explore the legal regimes that govern carriage of goods by sea and air carriage, and how the law limits the liability of carriers in some circumstances in a way that makes the transportation business economically viable and contributes to reductions in the cost of international shipping. The primary topics we'll look at are the Montreal Convention of 1999 for international air carriers, airway bills, general maritime law, the Hague Rules on bills of lading for ocean shipment, the Carriage of Goods by Sea Act, and marine cargo insurance. Frequently, when negotiating a contract for the sale of goods, the buyer and seller will include the details of how the goods will be shipped from point A to point B, whether by air, marine, or land carrier. In private contracts, the parties are usually free to make their own agreement and to decide upon whatever terms they find mutually agreeable. Even so, in aviation and maritime law, there is greater uniformity than in some other areas. This is partly because international conventions and treaties have helped to harmonize the effect of national laws. In addition, some of the similarities in how different countries approach liability issues relating to international transportation results from the influence of general maritime law. General maritime law is based on ancient customs that were observed over the centuries by courts, merchants, and ship owners, and then later put into maritime codes that became common among seafaring nations of Europe. The first convention or treaty that we'll discuss in this context is the Warsaw Convention for the unification of certain rules relating to international carriage by air. The Warsaw Convention has been replaced by a more recent treaty called the Montreal Convention. However, the Warsaw Convention remains important because many of the court judgments decided under this early convention are authoritative in applying and interpreting the Montreal Convention. The Warsaw Convention limited the liability of international air carriers for damage to or loss of cargo and for death or bodily injury to passengers. If an airline damaged cargo it was carrying on an international flight, the owner could recover no more than about $10 per pound from the airline. Likewise, if a passenger was injured or killed on such a flight, the surviving passenger or his heirs could not obtain more than $75,000 in damages from the airline. The liability cap was lifted if the claimant could prove that the airline had been reckless. However, by the last quarter of the 20th century, inflation and other factors had rendered the dollar value limits on air carrier liability seriously inadequate. The Warsaw Convention also was concluded in the 1920s, when the aviation industry was still very young. The convention was not adapted to modern technologies and transportation methods. So, by the 1990s, it was time for a new treaty. In the 1990s, the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, arranged a diplomatic conference to negotiate a treaty to replace the Warsaw Convention. The end result of this conference, the Montreal Convention of 1999, retained some of the structure of the earlier treaty, but significantly revamped the system on limitation of liability for international air carriers. According to the ICAO, in January 2015, there are 109 parties to the convention, including the United States. The Montreal Convention applies to all international carriage of persons, baggage, and cargo by aircraft, where the place of departure and the place of destination are in two convention countries. The convention also applies if the places of departure and destination are in a single Montreal Convention country if there is an agreed stopping place in another country, even if that country isn't a party to the convention. Let's see how this works. Our first example is a flight from Baltimore, Maryland to Los Angeles, California. This flight is not part of a larger itinerary. If a passenger is injured or cargo is lost or damaged, the Montreal Convention doesn't apply because it is a purely domestic trip. Our second example is a trip consisting of a flight from Baltimore, Maryland to Mexico City, Mexico. Mexico is a signatory to the Montreal Convention. Because the places of both departure and destination are located in convention countries, the convention does apply. Our third example is a trip from Baltimore to Caracas, Venezuela, with a later segment from Caracas to Los Angeles, California. Venezuela is not a party to the Montreal Convention. The convention does apply. The places of both departure and destination are in the same convention country, and there is an agreed stopping place in another country. The convention applies even if the country of the agreed stop isn't a convention country. This rule includes round trips from the U.S. to another country and back.